Excited. So we are in our sermon series, Four Perspectives, One Jesus. And today we're going to take a deep dive in the book of Mark. And we're going to take a look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, these four accounts of Jesus. And you may not realize this, or you may already, but each Gospel gives us a different perspective on Jesus. Each author wrote for a different reason. Each author had an intended audience and a reason for writing and recording the words of Jesus. And the other thing that I want us to call to your attention as we begin this series is the fact that these are historical documents. And I point that out because in this world, we often separate faith from science. And a lot of us have gone to school, high school, college, graduate school. There are some here among us, I'm sure, that have PhDs and great degrees. And in our culture today, we think of science as that thing that we know, you can test it and prove it, and history, you can have these documents and historical critical method to determine what's accurate and what's probably not accurate and all these kind of things. And then over here in another compartment, completely separate, is religion, faith, spirituality, right? And the only problem with that is that when you get to study these historical documents of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you start to realize they have just as much and probably much more credibility from a scientific perspective than many of the documents that we accept as valid and accurate and historical. And so I just want to kind of put it in that framework because sometimes we think, oh, Jesus, was he a real person? Did he actually come? Did he actually raise from the dead? That's the big one. A lot of scholars will say, well, maybe he was a real person, but he, couldn't have raised from the dead because humans can't do that, And we take this and we kind of say, well, to believe in Jesus, you just have to have faith. Okay? I think faith is important, but I want to tell you that the early records indicate all the people that wrote these things believed that they happened, documented that they happened, and there is a huge resource of materials, authors, documents, sources that indicate that a lot of different people said, this is the person, this is what he did, this is what he said, and this is what happened. And if you were to make this up, as some critics might say, there is a ton of evidence this is not the way you would have made up the story. And these four accounts, I want you to keep that in mind for the whole series, because these four gospel accounts, the way they talk about Jesus, the things they say about Jesus, the things Jesus says and does, if you were to make this story up, you would have changed a lot of things for a lot of different reasons. And remember last week, we talked about how Jesus' teaching was so out of harmony with so many of the pet theologies and teachings of the day, and that it wouldn't have made any sense for anyone to make up some teacher who would be so unpopular and so radical and talk about God in such a blasphemous way. Remember we looked at the parable of the prodigal son and this father that had this terrible, undignified love for this wayward son who was insulting to him, who dishonored the family. Nothing about that story fit with the culture of Jesus. In fact, it was incredibly countercultural. And we suggested the only reason Jesus would say such a thing is because it was true to who our Heavenly Father was. But nobody would just make that kind of thing up. So I'm just giving examples because I want to give you two things. I want to encourage your faith through this series, but I also want you to experience some feeling that there is credibility. This is not something that is make-believe. It's not something we just believe because we have faith. These are people that are telling us and documenting what happened. And Mark is the first one we're going to look at this morning. Many scholars, or one of the theories is that Mark was probably the first gospel that was written. We can't prove, of course, a lot of things, but we have to gather evidence and kind of draw conclusions. And one of the most obvious conclusions is Mark is the shorter of all the gospels. And it does look, if you line up all the texts, it looks like Luke and Matthew used Mark as their source, as one of their source materials. And in some places, Matthew and Luke have the exact wording as Mark. And then Matthew and Luke are much bigger. They add several more chapters, so they take some of the same stories and words, kind of cut and paste them, and then they embellish as they can, and we'll talk about that when we get to Matthew and Luke. But it's just evidence that Mark was probably the source, was probably the earliest written one, and probably Matthew and Luke. In fact, if you ever get a chance, and I couldn't, it'd be really hard for me to show it in a sermon, but they do have Bibles where they line them all up side by side. And you can see how Luke and Matthew at times are just word for word, exactly from Mark. And then what's funny is they'll add or subtract certain things and kind of put them together in the way they want to put the gospel together. But we have reason to believe that Mark probably wrote his gospel first. So, trivia question for you. Who is Mark? Anybody know? Who is this guy, Mark? John Mark. Very good. My second question was, what other name do we know him by? And he is known in the Bible as John Mark. Now, the Gospel of Mark, just for accuracy's sake, does not say written by Mark. So why do we think it was Mark? Well, all the early Christians that we have record of attribute the gospel to Mark. So that's why it carried, by the time it got included several centuries later into the official canon that we call the New Testament, it was called the Gospel of Mark, or in Greek, kata markon. And that's the gospel according to Mark. And so they accepted the witnesses, and there's many of them. So let's look at some of this evidence that we have for John Mark, and then we're going to ask you, who is John Mark, and what did he do, and how did he play a role in this early church? So number one, we have a quote from Eusebius. Eusebius lived in 300s, the 4th century. He lived in the 300s. He was the bishop of Caesarea Maritime. And Eusebius was quoting, you say, well, the 300s, that's a long time from Mark. Well, hold on. Eusebius said he was reading from the 5 books of Papias, or Papias. So who is Papias? Papias was let's see if they call him a bishop. He was the bishop of Hierapolis around 100 AD. So now we're getting very close to the early church. And he was a bishop there until 130 AD. And apparently, Papias wrote 5 books that were called Sayings of the Lord Interpreted. Now, the problem is, we don't have these books. We don't know what happened to them. They got lost, but Eusebius had them. And he was reading them, and he quotes from them, and he says, according to Papias, quote, and I'm going to read it to you. This also the presbyter Papias said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, that's interesting, wrote down accurately, though not in order. Okay, this is interesting. Have you heard this before? Some of this was new to me. He wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things that were said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, that is Mark. But afterward, as I said, he followed Peter. Okay? So he's telling us a little story. He's saying, Mark wasn't around when Jesus was teaching. He wasn't a disciple of Jesus. He didn't get to hear him in person. So Mark never heard Jesus in person, but he followed Peter. In fact, it says he was an interpreter for Peter. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but we do know that Peter was a fisherman. He probably did not speak Greek, and this was the language of the day. He probably didn't speak Latin. That was the main language in Rome. And Peter would have spoken Aramaic, which was the common spoken language in Israel. And so it's possible that Mark was traveling with Peter. We know there's some evidence of that, and that maybe he did some interpretation as Peter went to Corinth. We know he went there and a few other places outside of Jerusalem. So that's one possible explanation. So Mark, though he never heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he, Peter, remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. So there's an eyewitness account, and it's interesting that Eusebius goes on to say that Papias records that he knew this because John told him. So John was the only apostle that was not martyred for his faith, and he lived into the 90s AD. So Papias would have known him, and apparently he heard from John that Mark wrote his gospel because of his connection to Peter. So, and this is not uncommon, by the way. We accept as historians today that oral history is valid, because in those days there wasn't as much writing. You didn't have paper and pen and printed press, so you were there's no newspapers, as our children's story said, and so you had to pass down a lot of facts orally as the tradition was. So they would teach, and that's why you had scribes and teachers of the law and people that would teach, here's what he said, here's what happened, and they would pass it down from generation. And so this was, again, a very common way to pass this information. So who is this John Mark who apparently teamed up with Peter and wrote down everything Peter said that Jesus did? Well, in Acts, we have a couple references to him, so it gives us a little bit of light. One of the things I love is in Acts 12 and verse 12 and 13. It says, it's this fascinating story, and you may remember this in the book of Acts. Peter is thrown in jail, and he is in prison for his faith, and he's locked up in this dungeon, and God works this incredible miracle where he comes in the middle of the night with an angel. And when the angel shows up in Peter's prison cell, his chains fall off, the door opens, and all the guards are asleep. And it says that Peter walks out of the prison cell unscathed, untouched, but it says specifically Peter is still kind of groggy, and he says, well, this must be a dream. But it's actually happened. He's walking right out of prison with all the guards asleep. And one of the reasons he's walking out of prison is the Acts chapter 12 tells us there's a group of early Christians who are praying day and night for Peter. They are praying for his release. And here's what it says specifically in Acts 12:12. When, talking about Peter, he had escaped from the prison and the angel led him out of town, it says he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where the people had gathered and were praying. So John Mark's mother, Mary, common name of the time, is the home where all the early church is gathered, and they're praying into the wee hours of the night for Peter's release. And then Peter comes to that house, the angel leads him to the house, and he knocks on the door, and you can imagine how interesting that evening was. In fact, the Bible tells us that a young servant girl named Rhoda goes to the door, opens it, sees Peter, is so shocked that she slams the door, runs back and says, Peter's at the door. And they said, are you crazy? Like, here they are praying, but they don't actually believe he's at the door. Like, he's in prison, we're just praying for him. And like, no, he's not in prison. He's on our front porch. And Peter's standing at the door with it slammed in his face going, hey guys, I'd like to get in just in case the soldiers wake up, like, can I come in or not? So you have this whole funny story in Acts chapter 12. And the cool thing is it's happening at John Mark's mother's house, which tells me a little something about John's family, Mark's family. He's got a good mom. Good moms are important. So I just want to say to any mother out there, no matter where your kid is today, keep praying for him. Keep being that good mom. because we don't hear about John Mark right there, but we hear that it was his mother's house, and this is where the prayer is happening. It would be likely to assume he might have been there praying also. Now, it also kind of indicates, which we learn from other passages, that he was younger. So he would have been on the young side and would have been, and we learn this again when we get to the story in Acts 15, and this is the story we probably most know Mark for. It says that Mark was traveling with Barnabas, who was his cousin apparently, and Barnabas and Paul, because Barnabas would assist Paul. So they brought this young man along, and in Acts chapter 13 it says that at some point on the journey, John Mark goes back to Jerusalem. And it doesn't give us any explanation, it just says he leaves the journey and he goes back to Jerusalem, which apparently was near his home there. Well, sometime later in Acts 15, it says that Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we've preached the word of the Lord and go and see how they're doing." So they've gone, they've spread, they've raised up all these churches, and Paul says, "Barnabas, we need to go back, check on these churches, encourage them, fan the flames, support them, see how they're doing." Remembering they couldn't have frequent flyer miles in Southwest and all of that, so they had long trips to get to all these places. It took a long time to cover all this. So it says in verse 37 of Acts 15, Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark. But Paul did not think it was wise to take him, because he had deserted them and had not continued with them in the work. So Paul had little tolerance for people who deserted. Now, if you know anything about Paul, he was a bit extreme. This guy would go into a town, get stoned, not in the bad way, but, well, in the worst way, really. Stones would, be thrown at him, beat up. He would get thrown in prison. He would get shipwrecked on some place that he was going to. And he would just keep trucking, like nothing stopped Paul. Paul was 110% committed. Now, we don't know what happened for John Mark. We don't know if he got sick along the way, or if he was missing his family, or maybe he was missing his mom. She was so great, and after a year away or something, he said, "Well, I want to go check on her." We don't know why he left, but in Paul's mind, you don't leave the gospel mission trip. You do it, even if you get hit with rocks, we'll use that term, thrown in jail, whipped, beaten, shipwrecked. It doesn't matter. Paul, you never turn back. So he's like, nope, I only take the people that stay with me. Now Barnabas, probably being a little more balanced and a little more sensible, said, oh, come on, we'll keep training him. He's got potential, he's got talents. And this dispute, it says, between Paul and Barnabas became such a, quote, sharp disagreement that they agreed to go separate ways. So even in the early church, there can be disagreements, so we shouldn't be surprised when we see them in our church today. This is two very godly men, Paul and Barnabas, but they can't see eye to eye on where God is leading. Personally, that encourages me because it shows God can use us even when we don't disagree. And I don't think either man was necessarily wrong, but they disagreed, and the solution was they would go 2 different trips. So Barnabas, it says, took Mark, and he sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas, and they left and they went to Syria. And thus they encouraged the churches that way, and maybe that was God's way of having them kind of double up and hit a few more things than they would have together. I don't know. But that's another indication. So Barnabas, kind of this mentor for John Mark. Well, you say, well, how in the world does John Mark then end up with Peter, since the gospel seems to see he was traveling around with Paul? Well, there's a couple things that we know. Number one, when he went back to Jerusalem, Jerusalem was the place that Peter stayed for most of his ministry. It does appear that he went a few places, but Peter, we're told through church tradition and some of the accounts in Acts, stayed in Jerusalem. He ran the church. He was seen as the head of the church, the early church, and he did that primarily out of Jerusalem until later when he was sent to Rome, and eventually he would be martyred in Rome. And so it's possible when John Mark went back to Jerusalem that he brought tidings from Paul and the work that was done, and he became, someone that was useful to Peter in the mission and the ministry of the church. And we do have this quote in Peter's letter. Peter only wrote 3 letters that are recorded in the scripture, whereas Paul has, I think, about 14. And in Peter 5:13, 1 Peter 5:13, Peter says, "We send our greetings, and so does my son Mark." So there's a huge clue that Mark and Peter work together closely to the point where he specifically says, "I'm sending you greetings from me and my son Mark." You know both of us. And again, Mark is obviously someone in the church because he's referenced. When you're referenced in a letter like this, that means everybody should know who you are. There's no description, it's just Mark. You know, my son Mark, he sends. Oh, we know Mark, you know. He works with you, he interprets, he does different things for the church. So that gives us the background. Now there is a rumor you may have heard, and this one I remember hearing as a kid, so I'm sure you probably heard it too. There's this interesting line at the end of the book of Mark. In Mark 15, there's 16 chapters in Mark, and in Mark 15, there's this story when they come to arrest Jesus. Do you remember? Does anybody know where I'm going with this? They come to arrest Jesus. There's 2 verses that says there's a young man in the garden with the crowd, and he tries to escape as the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, and one of the soldiers grabs him, and he leaves his robe and he runs naked away and escapes without his robe. And this little story of whoever this person is who's not named is not in any of the other Gospels. And so the theory is, well, maybe it was Mark. Since he put it, he would have known it was him and his little story or something like that. The only problem with that is, of course, this statement that we have from the early church fathers saying Mark didn't hear Jesus or wasn't around for his ministry, that he learned it from Peter as he came into the church later after Jesus had already gone back to heaven. So whoever that young mystery man is that escaped with nothing, but did escape, we still do not know. If you want to think it's Mark, that's okay, but it does kind of contradict some of the testimony of the early church where it probably was just someone else. And maybe Peter, just being the kind of funny, crazy guy he was, just remembered this story and said, "Hey, Mark, remember that guy?" And they took his robe and he just ran off. And they just put it in their gospel. To me, that kind of fits Peter. He seemed a little bit crazy, and that story seems like one he might tell where the others just like, well, no need to mention that. But Peter put it in there. What else do we know about the setting at this time that it was written? Well, let me speak first to the date and then the setting. When was Mark written? We said there's some evidence that it was written first. In order for this to happen, there's a few clues. I'll give them to you. Number 1, Clement of Alexandria, who was another early church father, he claimed that Mark wrote his gospel while Peter was in Rome. Okay? So that gives us a window. When was Peter in Rome? Eusebius, the other guy we had just quoted earlier, Eusebius says that Peter came to Rome when Claudius was the emperor. So there's another clue. When was Claudius the emperor? By the way, you don't see atheists arguing about whether Claudius was a real person. Just a point. We don't have a ton about Claudius, but we have something. But we probably actually have more about Jesus than we do about Claudius. But I'm just comparing how we just accept Roman emperors and what they did and these legends about them. And even some scholars will say, yeah, we don't really know, like Nero fiddling while Rome burned. We don't know if he actually got out a violin and was playing while Rome burned. But it's a story that's told and just kind of accepted in academic circles, whereas Jesus is like, oh, no, well, he's probably made up or something. So just again, to make my point. So Eusebius says he was there during the reign of Claudius. We know that Claudius reigned from 41 to 54 AD. So there's your general window. In Acts 15, we know that took place in AD 49, and that's the story we just read of Peter coming out of prison. So in AD 49, he's in Jerusalem and getting rescued by angels. So that puts it down between 49 AD and 54 AD that Peter would have gone to Rome. And that time frame fits really well because we do believe, like Luke and Matthew and some of those might have been written in the 60s AD. And this would have had Mark being written in the mid-50s or late or early 50s AD, somewhere in that time frame. Church tradition also tells us Peter was martyred by the Emperor Nero. Nero didn't come to reign until 64 AD. So somewhere around 64 to 67 AD, Peter was martyred. We don't know exactly when, but obviously Mark had to have been written before Peter died, so we know whatever happened, This gospel is definitely written before early 60s AD. There's other interesting things about this gospel that I want to call your attention to. There's some unique literary pieces. One of the things, and probably the most prominent thing, is that this gospel is action-oriented. If you look at Mark chapter 1, he just jumps right in to the story of Jesus. And it kind of fits Peter, right? Because Peter in the Gospels, you can see he's always the first one. You know, you guys, Jesus says, you guys are going to deny me, whatever. Peter's like, no, we won't. I will be there. I'll fight for you. I'll die for you. Like, Peter's always speaking first, thinking later. And this is the way the gospel runs. Like, in Matthew, Luke, John, you have preliminaries. The first chapter is kind of a preliminary, or sometimes the first 2 chapters. In Mark, nope, it hits it straight with John the Baptist. We get through him in like 6 verses, and we're on to the miracles, the casting out of demons, and Jesus is just off to the races. And everything is action words. In fact, Mark uses the Greek word outhis. Outhis means immediately in English. Immediately. He uses it 42 times in 16 chapters. 11 times in the first chapter. He just starts it off running. The other thing he does is he uses present tense to tell past stories. So it's like he's putting you in the story as if it's happening right now. And the other Gospels don't do that. He does that over 151 times. He uses these action verbs in the present tense to tell past stories, like you're in the story, especially with the storm. Remember when Jesus is on the water and the storm comes up? Everything he tells in that story is present tense. So they're fighting the waves and the wind is beating against them, and you just feel the energy. He's trying to grip your attention with the action that is happening. He has Jesus being a very active, powerful person. The other thing that's noticed, and you heard in the quote that I first read you, is Mark groups things topically. So when you read Mark, it'll be helpful to note you're not reading the chronological account of Jesus' ministry. And you'll see it very clearly once you start reading it, because like at the beginning, it's demons and healing and the power of Jesus. Just chapter 1, it's like topical. Chapter 4, for instance, is all his parables, right in a row. Parable, 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 parable. Let me give you some other examples. Mark chapter 2, religious leaders and the controversy. He has like 5 controversies with the religious leaders. You don't keep the Sabbath. You're forgiving sins. You can't do that. All these controversies. So you can see that Peter, when he's giving the information to Mark to write down, he's not doing it as we probably would in the West, where we kind of tell the story from beginning to end. He's saying, oh, I remember these parables. Let's write them down. I remember these exorcisms. Let's put them down. I remember these controversies with the religious leaders. Here's the ones, and here's what they said. So you'll see this topical arrangement in the book of Mark. Another thing that's totally unique to the book of Mark is Mark uses this literary form called, let me get the correct term, intercalation. And what this is a fancy word that simply means sandwiching. So Mark he'll start a story and then put another story in the middle or another event and then finish the first story. And he does this over and over. We're not quite sure why, but we think it's thematic because it seems like Mark is saying, you know, here's this one thing that I want you to understand, and it relates to this other event. And now I'll conclude it with how this thing ends because they all go together. So let me give you some examples. Once you see them, you won't miss them because they're all throughout the Gospel of Mark. For instance, when Jairus came to Jesus saying, my daughter is sick, would you come please help her? On the way, Jesus is touched by a woman with an issue of blood. You have this whole story with her, and then you get back to the story of Jairus. And so you have these 2 women, a young girl, an old woman, and some say one represents Israel, one represents the Gentiles, and how Jesus came to save them both. And you can kind of see that maybe Peter, maybe this is kind of how he preached. You connect event and then you bring it back and you show how these are all related, how it's the same theme, how there's a spiritual connection. Mark chapter 3, Jesus' family comes to get him. Remember this story? And then you have the Pharisees accusing him of casting out demons by Beelzebub. And you have this whole controversy about Jesus being possessed by a demon and his response to that. And then it ends with the family being outside saying, hey, Jesus, come on out. And Jesus says, who is my family? It's those who believe and follow. So you have the family, Beelzebub, and family. You have the same thing in Mark chapter 6. He commissions the disciples. They go out. John the Baptist in the middle is put to death and beheaded. And then at the end, the disciples come back and report all that they did. In Mark chapter 11, you have a fig tree. He curses the fig tree. Then he goes and cleanses the temple. He comes back, and there's the withered fig tree. So again, you have this literary style that kind of points to general themes, and it's a fascinating thing that's unique to Mark. The other Gospels do not do this. Also, another thing you'll notice in Mark, if you read, is irony. And I don't know if Peter was a little bit sarcastic, but there's a touch of sarcasm and a touch of irony all throughout the Gospel of Mark. And the major kind of irony is the theme of the Gospel is that the insiders don't get it, but the outsiders do. The spiritual insiders miss it. The spiritual outsiders, they get it. And so you have the Pharisees, religious teachers, they're always puzzled and confused. They can't understand the teaching. But then you have sinners, tax collectors, drunks, Gentiles. They're the ones coming to Jesus. They're the ones accepting it. They're the ones receiving the salvation. There's this irony. You also have irony with, starting right at the beginning of the book, where Jesus names Peter the rock. And so it's almost like Peter kind of lets you in on the joke, because Peter in the gospel is not someone who is stable. He's not someone who is strong. And Peter, if he's the source of this, did not paint himself in a great light. In fact, what's fascinating in the Gospel of Mark is the disciples are basically painted as what not to do throughout the gospel. They are always the bad example in the Gospel of Mark. And so Peter, I think, was well aware of their failings when they were walking with Jesus. And of course, you would think Peter, probably more than most, would have that sense that, boy, we really failed Jesus when he was here. We could have done better. And look at us every turn. We don't have the faith. We don't understand. We ran away. We denied him. And so you have all these kind of ironic pieces that he's called the rock, and yet he's the very one that denies Jesus. You have Jesus in Mark chapter 6 saying, a prophet has honor everywhere but his hometown. And they try to kill him in his hometown, and you have this irony there. You have this irony at the end of the story where he's hanging on the cross, and the Pharisees are mocking him, saying he saved others, but he can't save himself. Which, of course, the author wants us to see is exactly what he intended. But to the Pharisees, it's this irony. And then, of course, at the very end, when Jesus breathes his last breath, it's a Gentile centurion that says, this was the Son of God. Surely. The Jews are mocking him. God's people are mocking him. But it's a pagan soldier that recognizes who was on that cross. So you have this irony, this juxtaposition between the insiders and outsiders. So it leads us to the last thing, and I want to leave this. We have a powerful message here with the book of Mark here at the end of my message this morning, and we're going to do part 2 next week, because Mark is divided clearly into 2 sections, and it's done pretty well with the chapters. So chapters 1 through 8 are section 1, or first half, and then the second half is 9 through 16. And in the first half of the Gospel of Mark, the theme and the emphasis is on the power and authority of Jesus, because he was the Son of God. In fact, he begins his gospel by saying he is the Son of God. And then what's interesting, for the last 8 chapters, the emphasis is on the suffering servant who came to give his life. So this powerful Son of God comes not to take the power, not to claim the power, not to take the throne, but to give and to suffer for mankind. So you have these 2 juxtapositions. And so I just want to share a bit of our message this morning as we close from this first part of the gospel so that you can leave with a taste, because I don't think Mark would want you to leave today without getting a taste of who this awesome Son of God is and who came and the power that he has and how it can change your life. And so let's just start in Mark chapter 1. You have at first, the first few verses are dedicated to a little bit about John the Baptist. And notice how he ends this little section. He says that John says in verse 8, chapter 1, verse 8, I baptize you with water, but he, the one who is coming, will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. So as a human, I can baptize you with water, but there's one coming who can baptize you with power in the Holy Spirit. So he sets the stage. Next thing you know, Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, and he beats the devil. So you see Jesus' power overcoming the devil and all the temptations. Next thing you know, Jesus is calling disciples, and the minute he calls them, what do? They leave everything, and they follow him. He has authority, he has a power. Then the next thing you see in verse 21, he's driving out an evil spirit at Capernaum. The man comes in, and he comes into the synagogue on a Sabbath day, and there's this demon-possessed man, and I'm sure it was chaos, and everybody's looking around. And Jesus simply says, be quiet, come out of him. And the spirit comes out of him. And look what the response of the people it is. In verse 27, it says, the people were all so amazed, they asked each other, what is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him. Isn't that beautiful? I just want you to think a minute for this, because this will become the theme from chapter 1 through 8. Everywhere Jesus goes, he has the power. Now that speaks to your life and to mine. This Jesus that you follow, even though, yes, he became the suffering servant, even though, yes, he will give his life on a cross, he also is the Son of God. He also has power even over evil spirits. He has power over the devil. Every time he shows up, he is the one who has the power. Even the religious leaders who repeatedly try to trap him and confront him and get him caught up in this, they have no power. They have no authority. In fact, the people keep saying, this man teaches with authority. We're amazed at who he is. He's something different than we've ever seen before. And the theme of this gospel is that crowds are always chasing after Jesus. The houses that he goes to are always packed and people can't get in. Mark chapter 2, the next chapter, is the one where it's so full that they have to tear open a roof to try to drop the man in to be healed by Jesus, because so many people are looking at him and saying there's power here, there's authority here that we've never seen before. I would love to see what Jesus would be like if he were in our world today, wouldn't you? And Mark would tell us if he came today, you would be blown away at the authority and power with which he conducted his life. Everybody who sees him was amazed. They were in awe. Over and over. Let me give you some of the other verses where this theme is continually repeated. So we said Mark 1, 22 and 27 both says people were amazed, they were in awe. You go to Mark 2, chapter 2 and 10 and 11. It says here in verses 10 and 11. Let me find them here for you. Okay. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong verse. Let me skip ahead to Mark 3:41. Mark 3:41. It says, wait, that's wrong too. Sorry, guys. I wrote down the wrong verses in my study here. Let me try 4:20. Let me make sure I didn't get them all wrong. All right. I did. Okay, Mark 2:10. Thank you, whoever said that. All right, so let's skip ahead to Mark 6. Sorry about that. I somehow had my chapters off. I was writing out of a laptop, and it's possible I did not pay attention to the headings. So, Mark chapter 6, we have this interesting quick story. And it's the story where Jesus goes to his hometown, the one where he's without honor. And it says something very interesting at this story. Because it says that the people said to themselves, "Where did this man get these things? What's this wisdom that he has, and that he can do miracles? Isn't this just the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? Isn't he the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. So they said, "Why? Who does he think he is? He's just one of us. We know his family. We know his sister. He's nobody special. Like, why is he going around? How is he doing all these things?" And listen to what Jesus says to them. Remember the theme of irony. Jesus says to them, "Only in his hometown, among his relatives and in his own house is a prophet without honor." In verse 5, he could not do any miracles there except for a few people that he healed. And he, Jesus, was amazed at their lack of faith. Do you see how the irony? He flips it. Everybody's amazed at Jesus, but in his hometown they're not. And now Jesus is amazed at their lack of faith. And because of their lack of faith, he could not do what he wanted to do. He could not heal all the people that needed healing. He could not work the miracles that he wanted to work. And I want to say Mark is giving us a lesson here. Peter is telling us something very important that Peter learned about Jesus. If you want Jesus to be the Son of God in your life, you have to believe that he is the Son of God of your life. If you want him to be the Lord, you have to believe that he is the Lord, because Jesus will not force himself. And if you do not want him to work a miracle, if you do not expect a miracle, if you do not look for a miracle, if you do not look to him as the Lord and you do not believe he has the power, then it won't happen. It's funny to me because psychology talks a lot about positive thinking and negative thinking. You kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have a negative mindset, then things tend to go more wrong for you, but a positive mindset, things tend to work out. Well, this was 2,000 years ago, and Mark is telling us, if you will have the faith, it can happen because you know somebody who can make it happen. And Mark is writing now to Christians and new Christians who didn't get to know Jesus, people who are living after Jesus has come and gone. And he's saying to them, I know it's tough, and Christians were persecuted in that first century, and I know it can be hard, but we follow someone who has the power and authority, and whatever you're going through, he can do it. He can help you. He can make a way. And I don't know what your week was like. I don't know what your month has been like. I know a little bit about what your year has been like because it's been pretty bad for all of us. But one thing I do know that Mark wants you to know today is that you serve a powerful Savior. And that even when things look the darkest, even when things look the bleakest, that is the time to pull closer to your Lord and Savior because he has the authority and power even over the devil. And I don't know about you, there are times in my life where I feel like the devil is just piling on. I had a few things this week that just felt like, okay, God, can you just stop him? Stop him for at least, a few hours so I can catch my breath, like just one thing after another, one thing after another. And the devil loves to just pick at us, nick at it, and just come at us. And sometimes it's just so overwhelming, and it's easy for us as humans to get discouraged and say, man, what am I going to do? Everything I try to do, it doesn't go right. Nothing good is coming of this. I just give up. I quit. It's so easy to get to that point in our sinful humanity, but Mark says, hold on. You're not alone. That devil can't do anything to you. There's one who has power to tell him to shut up and get out. There's one who can change your life. There's one who can deliver you from whatever you're in. And I know sometimes we get caught in addictions and habits and we struggle and we feel guilty and we say, and then sometimes we just give up. Like it's always going to be my struggle. I just never be able to change in this way. I'll never be able to overcome this. And the devil tells you that's who you are. You're just a terrible person. You're just a sinner. You'll never overcome this. You'll never be able to beat it. But Mark says, you know what? You have one who can put an end to whatever you're struggling with, who can deliver you no matter how low you are. And over in those first 8 chapters, we meet people who are imprisoned by the devil in ways we couldn't even imagine. In fact, as you get over to Mark chapter 7 and 8, you find this guy who's so badly demon-possessed, it says that he's living in chains, in half-clothed, and he screeches and screams, and everybody in the area is scared of him. Everybody that is, but Jesus. Jesus who says, hey, let's land the boat over here where the rocks and the cemetery is, and this crazy guy screaming and cutting himself. Let's go see him. I'm sure the disciples and Peter probably had some thoughts on why we're parking over there. Like, maybe we'll just land 100 yards up and just sneak up the hill over here. But no, Jesus saw him and went straight for him. And when Jesus went to cast the demon out, the demon said, my name is Legion, 1,000. My name is 1,000 demons because we are many. Now, I don't know how bad your life is or what kind of stuff you struggle with, but I'm pretty sure most of us in this room are not in that bad of a situation. I don't know how it gets any lower than this person. But guess what Mark tells us? Legion is no match for the Son of God. 1,000 demons is no match for the Son of God. And when Jesus said, get out, they got out. And they, of course, you know the story, went and killed the pigs and all that. But let me tell you, even though the people were a little scared by Jesus and his power, later that man who was the cut, screaming, living in the tombstones guy went and preached the gospel. And it says in the Bible that the people were amazed that this was the same man that had been cutting and screaming and was possessed by 1,000 demons, now in his right mind, telling everybody about this Jesus who delivered him, who brought him out of the deepest depths of sin and addiction and demonic possession, and Jesus broke him free. And so this weekend, as we celebrate freedom in this country, which is debatable and arguable, we can talk about something that is true, which is spiritual freedom that Jesus offers you. This weekend, as you take some time in the Word of God, talking to your Father, think about this Son of God who came to set you free. This Son of God who has all the power and authority that you need in your life right now. I don't know what you're wrestling with. I don't know what the biggest thing on your plate is right now. I don't know what the biggest problem is for you. Maybe you've changed jobs. Maybe finances is a real struggle. Maybe you're having a struggle with a child or a marriage. Maybe with a parent. Maybe in a relationship. Maybe it's something more along the lines of an employee thing that's happening, or just a health crisis that you're in. But whatever that obstacle, bring it to the Son of God. Give it to him. Lay it at his feet. And guess what? Mark tells us the only appropriate response once you do that is to be amazed and in awe with what God will do. Get ready to be amazed and in awe. And I don't know about you, but I look back on my life and there's been times where I just thought there's no hope. And now I look back and go, wow, I can't believe what God did. Everything I thought was collapsing, he then took and worked for good. Something where I thought there was no hope, he made it into the best thing that ever happened to me. Like, that's the God we serve. And so Mark says if you're going to let the Son of God, if you're going to believe in the Son of God, if you're going to trust in his authority and power, then get ready to be astonished, get ready to be amazed, get ready to be in awe, because that's the only reaction you will have when you see what he can do. And I don't know about you, I want to live in awe. I want to live in amazement of my God. And you and I have the privilege to do that. But we got to get our eyes off the devil. We got to get our eyes off this world and onto the one who is the Son of God with the power, who came to deliver, who came to set us free. And this is the weekend. And so I just ask you, take this weekend, take some time tomorrow, July 4. Make it your spiritual July 4. I'm giving you this one assignment. I want you to take some time. I'm going to say even 5 minutes will change your life. And I'm saying 5 because some of you won't do it unless I make it really low. And then it's like, okay, well, I can at least do 5 minutes. All right, 5 minutes. 5 minutes, you come into God's presence tomorrow morning, July 4, and you say to God, God, I think I need some spiritual freedom in this area. Whatever it is, you get to pick. He's not going to tell you what to pick. You pick. Maybe you need help in your marriage. Maybe you need help with your finances. Maybe you need help with your health. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a boss. I don't know. Maybe it's a child. Maybe it's a decision you're trying to make. You say, I'm coming to you as the Son of God. I want you to use your authority and power in this area of my life. I give you permission. Would you do that? Who wants to make a commitment? Just raise your hand if you're going to take 5 minutes tomorrow morning. Give it a try. I want to hear some stories. Now, it may not happen just at that moment. It may take a little time. I find that God's timing is always different than mine. But I want to say to you, and Mark says to you this morning, be prepared to be amazed at what he will do when you invite him to work in your life. When you give him that permission, when you reach out to him in faith and say, this is yours, God, this is yours. I give it to you, your power, your authority. You transform this area of my life. I give it to you. Are you wanting to be amazed? Anybody here want to be amazed and in awe? Amen. Hallelujah. That's what we're going to pray for. That's what we're going to look for. And this morning we're going to close our service by singing, leaning on those everlasting arms, those all-powerful arms. I'm inviting